All right, we are going to begin. So hello, everyone. My name is Rich Godshaw. I'm the Vice President of Individual and Group Benefits here at Walsh Duffield. I want to thank you for joining the webinar today, Retirement Plans in a Post-Pandemic World. And it's going to be presented by our very own Lisa Petronio. She's the Vice President of Walsh Duffield's Retirement Plan Solutions. The webinar today is part of the summer school series where we host different subject matter experts each week to discuss some of the topics surrounding insurance, employee benefits, and the challenges we are facing in this pandemic. If you haven't had a chance to check the lineup that we have, please visit walshduffield.com/summer school for a full description of the presentations and links to register. Before I introduce Lisa, I did want to take a minute to let everyone know this seminar is being recorded, and a recording and the slides will be posted after the event. This presentation is also approved for one SHRM professional development credit, one HR recertification credit through HRCI, and an email code will be sent for the credits for all of you who attended. Also, please send any questions or comments you have in the Q&A box. We will certainly answer those questions at the end of the event during that portion. With that, I'm happy to introduce Lisa Petronio. Lisa is the Vice President of Retirement Plan Solutions here at Walsh Duffield. She keeps a focus on client education. She believes that empowerment for fiduciaries as well as participants can make better decisions to drive better outcomes. Today, Lisa will be discussing lessons learned from the pandemic, actions that could be taken, and the post-pandemic retirement trends. At this point, I'm going to pass it on to Lisa. Thanks.
Thanks, Rich. Well, some of those topics sound like we're going to get a little heavy. Post-pandemic trends, I know we've all been experiencing this for over 18 months now. So I would love to just kind of start off with a little bit lighter. If you want to just drop in the chat how you would describe summer 2021 in 3 words or less. And we can think about how we've started to reflect on at least the last few months, which have been a little bit brighter compared to the beginning of the pandemic. While we wait for some of those to come in, I'll tell you, we're not quite out of the pandemic yet, but we're already starting to reflect on our experiences from the last 18 months. In my world, being focused on financial well-being, there's really 2 primary lessons that have emerged. I'm seeing some words in the chat like tense, uninspiring, rainy. It's sounding still a little bleak. Someone said there's been a learning curve. I can definitely agree with that. And I do think that the pandemic is a great time for us to reflect on what we've just experienced and think about the future and what we might be doing differently. So when I think about the pandemic from a professional standpoint, it first really highlighted the financial fragility of our workforce. So financial well-being has been a really hot topic well before the pandemic. We've been talking about financial wellness for years, and it's kind of shifted and shaped over those years. We're keenly aware that many Americans were not adequately prepared to handle a financial emergency. And when the pandemic came around, that really only amplified those financial challenges that our employees and our participants have been facing. And since the start of the pandemic, 63% of employees have said that their financial stress has increased. For those employees who did say, my financial stress has increased because of the pandemic, they were twice as likely to have used a payday loan or a payday advance in the last year. They were twice as likely to have taken a loan or a distribution from their retirement account. And they were twice as likely to be considering postponing their retirement. So unfortunately, very similar to some of our comments, it's been a little bleak or depressing when we think about our financial status in light of the pandemic. But beyond exposing the financial fragility of our workforce, the pandemic also elevated more awareness around these financial inequities that various groups in our community have faced for a very long time. So economists in the midst of the pandemic were talking about a K-shaped recovery. And when they said things like a K-shaped recovery, they're really referencing that for some people, the pandemic had a really dramatic and negative impact on their financial situation, while there were other people who found that the pandemic put them in an even stronger financial position. You might think, well, how is that possible? And really, it was a combination of government stimulus coupled with reduced spending. You couldn't get out and spend any dollars anywhere. So there's been this really dichotomous experience that Americans have had in how they have financially been impacted by the pandemic. So when we think about financial wellness in a really broad sense, I said we already know that a lot of workers didn't have enough money saved for an emergency savings before the pandemic. And according to a study that was published earlier this year, fewer than 4 in 10 Americans had enough money set aside to cover even a $1,000 unexpected expense. Experts recommend that you have 3 to 6 months of expenses set aside in case of emergency. So if we use that definition, 3 to 6 months, just about 40% of workers who earned less than $40,000 entered into the pandemic with an appropriate amount of emergency savings. I'll say anecdotally, I was surprised. I thought that number was actually a little bit higher than I would have expected. And you might say, well, what about those people who have higher incomes? You know, they must be better prepared, right? Slightly. For those that had incomes over $80,000, that number increases from 40% to about 60% having adequate emergency savings. So even at those higher incomes, 4 out of 10 people didn't have enough saved for a rainy day. So we talk a lot about emergency savings is built for a rainy day, your rainy day fund. If that's true, then COVID was like a hurricane that came through. And nearly 40% of people who had emergency savings prior to March of 2020 had to dip into those funds during the pandemic. Of those who needed to tap into emergency savings, 60% of them blew through most, if not all, of their emergency savings. So one of the first things we're going to think about as we're coming out of the pandemic is how to either establish or rebuild that emergency savings. And that's going to be a key financial priority for our workers. So if you weren't bought into the idea of having money stashed aside for a rainy day before COVID, this certainly was a wake-up call for many people. So for those who don't have an emergency account or emergency savings today, nearly half of them have now committed that they're going to start saving. We get a little bit more granular and we look at specific demographic groups. We recognize that folks have had really different experiences based on their race or based on their gender. And the pandemic really shone a light on those inequities. So in 2016, you can see on the right, white families had about $130,000 more, 6 times more in average retirement savings than Black or Hispanic families. And this disparity has increased more than 5-fold over the last 25 years. The gap has become more important as this chart is talking about liquid retirement savings, vehicles like 401ks or 403b plans. And as those have replaced more traditional defined benefit pension plans, it really shows where the differences have lied. So why does this gap exist? It's not just income differences. Even when we look across the same income level, the gaps remain. Black and Hispanic families have less access to workplace retirement plans, and they have lower participation rates when they do have access to a plan through work. But even beyond that, we know that it's not just about access and participation. That's not the full story. Black workers are somewhat less likely to participate in employer retirement plans than white workers. Some studies have suggested about a 7% difference in participation rates. But there's a significantly bigger difference in average retirement savings. So why is that? You know, we could expand access to workplace retirement plans, for example, thinking about eligibility, how someone becomes eligible under your plan. But that's not going to close the gap alone, especially if lower income groups continue to contribute at lower levels and if they're more likely to be withdrawing money earlier to cover financial emergencies. You can start to see how this is all intertwined when we reflect on the pandemic. Additional studies have suggested that people of color and women in particular are more likely to invest more conservatively relative to other demographics, which really drives further disparity in these income savings levels. Fidelity has done a lot of research on the topic. And when Fidelity thinks about financial wellness, they've really defined that in 4 main domains: budgeting, debt, savings, and protection. And financial wellness under those 4 domains really includes everything from taking care of your day-to-day expenses all the way through to long-term care planning, estate planning, everything that happens in between as you're living life. So among employees that have access to a workplace retirement plan, 1 in 10 have financial wellness scores that need attention. But that number for Black employees is 2.5 times higher. And among Latinx, it's nearly twice as high. So again, these differences persist even after accounting for differences in household income. So again, suggesting that income disparity is not the only cause. When Fidelity considered those 4 key domains in financial wellness, it turns out that everyone across all demographics really needs help with budgeting. That is an area of focus regardless of racial identity. But what about those other 3 domains, savings, debt, and protection? When Fidelity took into account the differences in household income, Black and Latinx employees were falling short on those 3 domains. So these particular disparities suggest that either the existing messaging or the solutions for these topics are not resonating with certain groups, which really begs me to ask, why is that the case? Sometimes you might think it has to do with imagery and making sure that the imagery that we're using in retirement plan communications are inclusive and representative of all of our employees. But there's more when we think about priorities relative to retirement savings. Black Americans and Latinx Americans were more likely to agree that it's more important to help friends and family now than it is to save for their own retirement compared to white Americans. Latinx and Black Americans were more likely than white Americans to agree that saving for a child's education or paying off a child's education is reducing how much they're able to save for retirement today. So when we think about how to reach various groups within our employee bases, it's important to remember that each might be driven by different top financial priorities. So we may have designed this great retirement plan, but you have employees who are saying, that's all well and good, but retirement isn't actually my top financial goal. I have these other goals that I want to meet. How can we use financial well-being to meet participants where they are and help them to achieve those goals that are most important to them? That's what we'll contemplate further today. But we'll pause first and launch our first polling question. When you think about your participants today, what are they most interested in? And we've already started talking about financial wellness, emergency savings. We'll get into student loan repayments and ESG investing, environmental, social, governance investing. Sometimes we have to help our participants to understand what options are available, and then they think, oh, I am really interested in that. All right, I'll continue while we wait for those results to come in. It looks like financial wellness is the number 1, emergency savings number 2, student loan repayments coming in 3rd, ESG, not that interesting yet. Good to know. 3 out of 4 workers have said that they want their workplace to provide more resources to help them with their overall financial well-being. And as we just outlined, emergency savings is the first stop on that journey. There's 2 main ways that you can support employees' emergency savings efforts. So first, there are options within the retirement plan. You may have seen in the news that UPS rolled out a solution for their employees several months ago. It's possible to use after-tax contributions, which are separate and distinct, not the same as Roth contributions. So using the old after-tax contributions to create an emergency savings component within the retirement plan. That's one option. And then there are a number of solutions that are available outside of the retirement plan that can allow for automated savings to an outside account. Some of those can even include employer matching contributions right into that account. And there's really a third way that's coming. It's on the horizon. There's been legislation introduced in Congress that will create a new category of retirement plan distributions that would allow for one emergency distribution per calendar year, up to $1,000 without tax penalty. It's still just proposed legislation right now, but stay tuned because there's a lot of interest on Capitol Hill right now for what we can be doing to help Americans post-pandemic. And as Congress is dreaming up some of those ways to support Americans after the pandemic's over, there's continued and growing interest in student loan benefits with retirement plans. There's been legislation introduced in Congress that will create a solution for employers to match employees' student loan payments with a contribution from the employer to their 401k or 403b account. So there's some companies like Abbott Labs that have done this. They've received approval from the IRS through a private letter ruling. And the IRS was actually inundated after Abbott Labs came out and started sharing with the world what they had done in creating the student loan integration. And the IRS said, we're getting too many requests for this. Instead of looking at these on a case-by-case basis, we're going to try and make a legislative fix that's going to make it really clear to employers how they can design a plan that has that student loan feature within it. In the meantime, outside of retirement plans, there are lots of different ways that you can design a standalone student loan repayment benefit. And those types of programs received a boost from the CARES Act. Through 2025, employers can contribute up to $5,250 towards eligible education expenses like tuition or those student loan repayment programs without increasing the employee's taxable wages. This really clears one of the hurdles that employers were facing when they were considering whether they wanted to implement a student loan program. So as the labor market tightens and employers continue to look for new ways to attract talent to their organization or retain great talent that they have, we believe that student loan repayment programs are going to continue to be an attractive consideration. We'll see continued uptake and adoption from employers. I'll just touch briefly on environmental, social, and governance issues. We do see that this is a growing area, especially within particular demographics. For example, the millennial generation seems to have a stronger interest in these environmental, social, and governance investments. So what is ESG investing? Environmental, focusing on things like climate change, natural resources, pollution or waste. Social factors, being focused on how your organization is utilizing their human capital, what type of product liability they might have, if there's any stakeholder controversy. Governance, being focused on diversity of maybe their board of directors, corporate behavior, governance, how much transparency they have around the company's operations. And we're seeing that ESG fund managers, along with a growing number of traditional investment managers, are considering these types of factors when they're selecting investments because they anticipate that the long-term success of companies that are managing these factors thoughtfully will ultimately drive higher and better investment results. So these types of investments are already relatively popular among nonprofit organizations, and the current Biden administration seems more open to kind of paving the fiduciary way to allow these types of investments in retirement plans. A recent study suggests that more than 50% of participants are interested in investing in ESG, and 2 out of 3 would be more interested if ESG performance were comparable to just the regular investment options that exist under the plan today. Through the lens of ERISA, the reason why a plan might consider offering ESG funds is really because you believe the consciousness for those factors I mentioned is going to drive a material difference in the risk profile and ultimately in the long term provide more competitive and sustainable rates of return from those companies. So, you think about it, if a company, if you're going to invest in a company that relies really heavily on renewable energy, they might have a low, when you think long term, they might have a lower business risk than one that is focused on, utilizing fossil fuel. And for me, ESG really fulfills inclusionary goals in two different ways. So one from the perspective of participants who might be interested in investing in these types of investments for the social impact that they'll have, and then from a broader impact of governance. So many of these investment managers are looking for and starting to realize that there's trickle-down benefits from investing in those companies that prioritize diverse representation on the boards of the companies that they're investing in. And then finally, I mentioned financial wellness. We've really been reestablishing the case for financial wellness, and employees have started to expect that employers are going to be providing them with some resources that are going to support their financial well-being. It's clear that they want help, whether it's specific advice or if it's just validation of decisions that they're making on their own. And employers are really in a unique position that they can provide this type of financial support. We've seen the utilization rates for financial wellness solutions continue to climb. And the solutions in the market are very broad. You have fully outsourced technology-focused solutions. You've got integrated technology, maybe in-person solutions that are available through retirement plan record keepers. And then there's standalone, in-person, one-on-one individualized solutions, and all kinds of combinations in between. We know there's a ton of really terrific resources that are available through those retirement plan record keepers, but the greatest challenge is really getting participants to engage in the great tools that are available to them. We can barely get them to log in and name a beneficiary on their account, and now we're suggesting that they log in to watch a 10-minute video on budgeting because we all need it. Only the people who are really most dedicated or most interested in that are going to naturally seek out that type of engagement. And they might not be the ones who need it the most. So we really believe that financial wellness engagement is going to require some sort of a human component. You need some person that's going to be able to reach out, make a connection with that employee or that participant, and help drive that engagement with some of these tools. The bottom line here for plan sponsors is make sure you know what your record keeper offers. Develop a plan that's going to drive engagement if this is a goal of yours, and then measure the results. Check in to see, are we making progress? Is our message resonating? How might we be able to shift that? We're going to launch our second polling question now. And this is focused on auto enrollment. Does your plan currently have automatic enrollment features? And if yes, what is the default rate? Where are they starting when they get auto enrolled in your plan? Second question, what type of contribution does your organization provide? Are you matching? An employee has to contribute dollars in order to receive employer dollars. Is it non-matching? Everybody's going to get a contribution regardless of whether they contribute to their own plan. Both. Some people have a combination of the two, or neither. We're not in a position to be offering an employer contribution right now. Let's see. All right, looks like 44% don't have auto enrollment today. And those that do kind of split between somewhere in that let's get started range, 1% to 3%, or maybe we're a little bit further along. We've got them starting in that 4% to 6% range. And in terms of contributions, pretty evenly split across the board, matching, non-matching, both. So now that we've reflected on some of these lessons that we've learned from the pandemic and contemplated what some of those trends are, what actions can we be taking to build for a better future? What do we do with this information? I feel like I've laid down some heavy information this morning. What can we do to change the outlook? First, it's time to double down on auto features. For those that have adopted automatic features, just drop a word or a phrase in the chat that describes how your employees have reacted to auto enrollment. Automatic enrollment has really proven to be successful in helping to close the participation in savings gaps across racial identities. I discussed that earlier. Automatic enrollment is the easiest way for us to solve for that. And if you've applied it only to new hires, consider a re-enrollment that might capture your existing employees through the auto enrollment process as well. We've seen such great success applying it to new hires. Let's go back and capture all those employees who've been working with you for 5 or 6 or 10 years who may not be at the right savings rate. We have a client that recently added auto enrollment and saw their participation rate jump from less than 40% to over 85%. That is impactful when you think about making a change for these employees. Other suggestions are to boost auto escalation rates. So traditionally, if you have an auto escalation feature, it might be once you've been auto enrolled, if you don't make any changes, we're going to increase your contribution by 1% each year. Consider making that 2% each year. Think about the cap. 10% is a common cap. We're going to increase it by 1% every year until you get to 10. Maybe it's time to move that to 15. So doubling down on auto features is one of the easiest ways to rise tides for all groups. And be sure to consider how your auto enrollment rates align with how your employer contributions are structured. So there should be some thought around why we've selected the default rates that we've selected. Is it so that they can maximize the contribution that the employer is willing to make? When it comes to employer contributions, there is no right or wrong. I'm going to run through a couple philosophies about how you might think about those employer contributions. So one school of thought is what we call the stretch match. Let's stretch that match out so that we can encourage employees to save more under the plan. In a typical stretch match, companies are going to reduce the percentage that they match while increasing the amount of pay that they're willing to provide that match on. So, for example, instead of offering 50 cents for every dollar that the employee contributes up to 6% of pay, employers might consider offering 25% on every dollar the employees contribute up to 12% of pay. Employees don't really have much affinity to what the match percentage is. They're focused on how much you're going to match up to. So although the stretch match isn't a new idea, it really is a timely solution as we think about organizations that are coming out of the pandemic and may need to be looking for ways to shift some of their matching costs into the future while the business or their economy recovers. In addition, as I mentioned, that stretch match really encourages higher savings rates because workers think, I need to contribute at least that higher dollar amount so that I am getting all of that free money that's on the table for me. And it really helps them to save more for retirement and achieve those goals. Second idea, although the match is usually expressed as a percentage of salary, research really shows that many people struggle to understand percentages. So another option is to consider a fixed dollar match, which really converts that match into a lump sum dollar amount as opposed to a percentage of pay. So, for example, a company could give every worker an annual $1,200 match if they keep saving. So that would be the equivalent of 50 cents on the dollar up to 6% for a pay of about $40,000 of income. Because a fixed dollar amount leads people to think about, what could I spend if I had another $1,200? What could I buy? Maybe I could buy the new iPhone. It really makes them think harder about leaving some of that money on the table. Psychologically, it's really easy for someone to give up 6% match because I don't really know what 6% is, but it's a lot harder to let go of $1,200. So there's some behavioral science that really informs the idea behind that fixed dollar match. If you think about the plan through an equity lens, you might decide to forego this matching altogether and think instead about a non-matching contribution. That is making a contribution to all employees' accounts, regardless of whether they're in a position to contribute their own money to the account. This is an idea that's really being promoted by Alice from the United Way for the asset limited income constrained employees. A way that you can support those who may be on the lower end of the income scale, may not be able to afford to contribute their own money, but you're able to help them meet some of those financial goals and the benefits that their families will reap down the road for that. So as I said, there's really no right or wrong, just a couple different philosophies. The key is that you periodically go back and review the design of your retirement plan and ensure that it's continuing to meet the needs of both the employer and driving those outcomes that you want for employees, for those plan participants. Make sure you know why you have the design that you have. Many times a retirement plan was set up 10, 20, 30 years ago. And if you don't revisit it, the reasons why you set that plan up the way you did may no longer exist, or maybe they've changed. So do the reasons still apply today? And is it maybe time to reconsider how we're structuring that employer contribution and many other factors? And then consider reviewing your retirement plan outcomes by race or ethnicity. For some employers who have really made a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're starting to see interest around how can we kind of dive a layer deeper. I showed some stats earlier from Fidelity that suggest when you look at the average or the total group, it may look like everybody is doing pretty good. But when you dive a layer deeper and look at subgroups, you see there's maybe some populations that we need to do more for. Is there more support that we can be providing? Race and ethnicity is not often reported by employers to the record keepers, and I don't know of many record keepers that are even collecting that data. So this is a project that does require some additional analysis, data collection. There's obviously privacy concerns. This will allow you to look another layer deeper to better understand your participants, what challenges they might be facing, and how your committee can contemplate how to best support them in the future. How can we think about some of those different financial priorities and craft a financial well-being program that's going to meet them focused on the topics that they're most interested in? Maybe it's not retirement today. What can we do to help them take that next best step in their financial journey? And then finally, contemplate your committee composition from an inclusion standpoint. Are there any voices that aren't being represented at the table today? As a consultant, I'm really sensitive to the fiduciary liability that comes with serving on a retirement plan committee. And if that's a concern, you might consider the role that non-voting members can play as well. Participating in the committee could also be an engagement strategy or a form of succession planning as you think about developing those in your organization for the next step in their career. I'm going to launch one last polling question. This is a bonus trend as we think post-pandemic. Does your plan use revenue sharing? So revenue sharing is where you might build in the cost of other plan expenses like record keeping, administration, advisor, audit into the cost of the investment. So participants can see an all-in cost when they look at the investment lineup. Over the years, we have seen trends moving away from revenue sharing, looking for more transparency. There can be some issues around whether there's certain employees or participants who are paying more than others if that revenue sharing is not equal. So for many who do continue to offer revenue sharing, I do often hear, yeah, we offer it, but I'm a little concerned that, some employees might be paying just a little bit more than others. Is that fair? A lot of that has shifted towards debit credit model. We'll continue to collect that revenue sharing, but we're going to credit it back to the participants. So we don't have to worry about any inequities. Everybody's going to pay the same amount. It just might look a little different on their statements. Down to zero revenue sharing. We're just going to cut that all out. It's going to be very transparent. And we're really seeing, especially in those jumbo market trends, a lot of times retirement plan trends start with the $1 billion plans. They come down to the plans that have a couple $100 million to the tens of millions, and they just come right down market. So right now, jumbo plans are moving away from revenue sharing. There has been a big focus from plaintiffs' attorneys on revenue sharing, and so many employers have said, let's shift away from that model. Even if we feel like we have a solution or the reason why we've picked the strategy that we have, even if we feel like it's defensible, why entertain the questions? Why don't we just go right to transparency, and then we don't have to answer any of those questions. It makes it easier from an administration standpoint. So I do see that about 70% of folks said, I think I'm gonna have to phone a friend on this one. I'm not too sure. If that's you, I suggest reaching out to your record keeper and asking the question about, are we using revenue sharing? How are we collecting and paying for those plan expenses? So we've now covered some of the pandemic trends, lessons learned, and what you can do as you think about how we're going to bounce back from the pandemic. And we're seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. There are a lot of strategies for how we can support our employees, meet them where they are, and help them find that next best step in their financial journey. So with that, we're going to turn it over for some Q&A.
Great, thanks, Lisa. That presentation is definitely very timely and informative. And we have several questions that have been submitted. And as a reminder, if you have a question that you have not yet submitted, please enter it in the Q&A chat box, and we'll get through as many questions as time allows. So one of the questions that came in, Lisa, is what are some of the solutions or vendors that Walsh Duffield uses for financial wellness?
Oh, good question. So I think financial wellness is kind of a continuum. There are some employers who are really cost conscious, and so they're looking for how can we leverage solutions that are going to maybe have no cost out of pocket. And we've got solutions where you may have access through your existing retirement plan record keeper to a variety of different videos, content, platforms, calculators. And so you can just work on leveraging what's already available from your existing vendors. I think that's a starting point or an entry point for most people if you haven't already started to integrate financial wellness into your offering. Next step from there is maybe looking at, well, how do you bring in that human component? How do we help connect people to those topics that are most important to them so that, we're really driving the engagement that we want with some of those technology tools. And then there's third-party solutions where off-platform, one that's been really popular with some of our clients is called Pete the Planner, Your Money Line, where it really is access to a CFP or a financial coach who can be an accountability partner and help your employees connect on those topics that are most important to them.
Great, thank you. Another question came in. Are you seeing employees putting their money into target date funds and Roth options more in our current environment?
Well, let's see. Let's take those one at a time. Target date funds. Yes. I mean, target date funds have continued to grow as the largest asset class under a retirement plan today. And that's driven by a couple of reasons. think one is that employees feel like they don't have the knowledge, the time, the resources, or the expertise to put together their own investment portfolio. And, I think all the better if we have a solution that provides them with a diverse portfolio. From an investment standpoint, if somebody creates their own investment portfolio and then there's market volatility, like there was right at the beginning of the pandemic, I find that a lot of the participants who put together their own portfolio are all of a sudden second guessing themselves. Do I really know what I'm doing? Did I really put the right amount in stocks versus bonds in fund A versus fund B? Whereas those that have chosen to invest in target date funds have some comfort in knowing I have somebody, there's professionals who are watching this and they understand the market and the economy and they're going to manage this investment portfolio for people at the same time horizon for me. So I think that participant mindset has really driven folks to target date funds and an auto enrollment. Automatic enrollment, we're really giving them the path. Here's how much you should save. Here's where you should be invested. You're telling them if you don't do anything otherwise, we're going to help you get there. And so those two factors have really driven a lot of participants towards those target date funds. And I'm a fan. I think that's a good thing. And from a fiduciary standpoint, you should feel good too, because you get that protection as the QDA, as the default option under the plan. You're protected from those decisions. Roth has been available in retirement plans since 2006. And we still have some plans. We come across plans that haven't even added Roth as an option. So, first you've got that first hurdle. We're finally to a point where about 70% of plans are offering Roth contributions to their employees. Right now, this is not a political statement. This is a mathematical statement. We, as a country, have a lot of debt. We've brought on a lot of debt in response to the pandemic. And the number one way that we raise revenue for the government is through taxes. So we know taxes are going to go up. We just don't know who they're going to go up for or how much. But I would say that Roth is really attractive now. You think taxes might be going up in the future. That being said, I still see utilization is low unless you have somebody who is in there communicating what the difference is between pre-tax and Roth. Particularly for lower income, it makes a ton of sense. I saw a statistic recently, said something like 60% of Americans didn't pay taxes. So if you're in that group and you can, you're in the lowest tax bracket and you can get that money put away Roth, think of all the growth that would be tax-free. So I think it's a lot of communication and education in order to get that participant utilization rate up. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see more employers consider dynamic automatic enrollment, where maybe those who are below a certain income threshold get auto-enrolled into Roth, as those above that dollar amount go into pre-tax in order to drive some of that.
Great, thank you. Again, as a reminder, if you do have a question that you have not yet submitted, please enter it in the Q&A chat box. Another question that came in, Lisa, is with student loan repayment programs on the rise, are you seeing other programs offered by employers to increase or be more inclusive to those who want to go back to school or save for a child's education?
Great question. So I think there's this perception that when we talk about student loan repayment programs, that we're talking about folks who have graduated from college maybe within the last 10 or 15 years. But it is not so surprising to me that there are many people across many different generations that are carrying student loan debt. And that could be, someone who's Gen X who, is carrying student loan debt from 20 plus years ago. It could be baby boomers who are carrying student loan debt for their children, some of those plus loans. It can be folks who went back and got a degree later in life. So there is a lot I think the student loan conversation is really much broader than just recent college graduates. And employers, when they're thinking about crafting these programs, I know are really sensitive to how are we going to draw the line? So, do we have to wait for someone to have student loan debt in order for them to qualify for this program? Or is there some sort of integration with if you offer tuition reimbursement, for example?
Great, thank you. And the last question that we have in the queue right now is, are you seeing a shift of employee communication, website tools from retirement plan vendors?
So the retirement plan vendors have long been developing technology, and we've really seen that shift over time in response to what they've learned from behavioral finance. So for example, you used to log into your website, and depending on your record keeper, maybe some of you do still log into your retirement plan website. And when you hit the first page, you see your balance kind of in bright lights. But the challenge is that most people, when they look at that number, they think, wow, that might be the biggest dollar amount I've ever seen. Look at how much I've saved. Great job, self. Where there's a disconnect is whether that dollar amount is really enough to maintain the lifestyle that you're expecting in retirement. So we've seen retirement plan vendors kind of shift away from when you land there, here's what your balance is, here's what your rate of return is, to more of them, when you land there, you're going to see some sort of a wellness score. You might see, most people do still want to see their balance. So you're going to see the balance right there. It's going to be somewhere, but they're really starting to elevate awareness around some of these tools. So depending on the vendor, it might be a number. It might be a weather forecast. It might be, is your dollar full? So, pick your vendor, pick your marketing gimmick, if you will. But the idea is helping people understand and answer maybe the more important question of, am I on track? So we're seeing that shift. And then there's this concept of like digital behavioral finance, like how we as plan sponsors or as consultants don't really have control over how our record keepers are designing their websites, but there's a lot of behavioral research and science that goes into, tracking where someone's eyes look when they're on the page, and using things like different colored font, or you see a lot more of the slider bars, because it's really inviting when when you land on a page that says, kind of shift how much you're saving to see how it'll change your future. We as humans, that gamification, we're like really attracted to that. We want to play with it, right? And then using those tenets to drive better behaviors. Okay, if we get people to engage with the tool, they're more likely to realize, oh, gee, increasing my contribution by 1 or 2% really isn't going to be that much more out of my paycheck, but look at how much it'll change my outlook. So that's the type of shifts that we're seeing, and they may not be big shifts, but you kind of see these little pieces that we're learning from research and behavioral science being integrated into what record keepers are providing on the website experiences.
Great. Sounds like there's a lot of digital tools out there. So the last topic I want to just touch on is cybersecurity. And can we talk a little bit about that and what vendors are doing, and any sort of fiduciary responsibilities we'd have with that?
Thanks, Mike. Cybersecurity has been a really big topic. The Department of Labor recently released 3 pieces of guidance regarding cybersecurity: 1 for vendors, 1 for plan sponsors, and 1 for participants. And the focus is really on elevating to make sure that all of those parties are doing their part to protect their information. We're continuing to see cybersecurity across all industries. We're seeing, cybersecurity attacks that are impacting our supply chains. And I think the Department of Labor has really recognized there's so much money inside retirement plans that we need to make sure that vendors are serious, plan sponsors are serious, and participants are doing their part as well. So definitely want to be considering what your vendor is doing as it relates to cybersecurity, making sure that you have up-to-date data security language built into your service agreement, that you understand what their protocols are, and if they offer any participant guarantees. So some of them, will offer indemnification, or that they'll make the participant whole if something happens to their account. And then making sure that your participants are doing their part. Number one thing that they can be doing, creating a username and password on the website. If they haven't gone in and created a username and a password on the website, I just have to assume, Equifax, maybe we've all forgot that Equifax exposed something like a third of Americans' information. So I think it's just safe for us to assume that my data, my social security number, date of birth, and name are probably listed somewhere on the black web that someone can buy it. And so if we just operate under that assumption, I want to be the one to go in and claim my account and make sure that it's my email address that gets all those confirmations if I make a change. So really encouraging participants to do their part, creating strong passwords, but really making sure they get that username and password set up so that if something happens to their account, they get notified and they know, and it doesn't linger or perpetuate.
Great. Thank you so much for answering all those questions. And I'm going to turn it back to Rich, and he'll close things out. So thank you, everyone.
All right, well, that's going to wrap this up. First, Lisa, thank you for sharing your insight and expertise. I happen to love retirement and 401k information. I thought it was great. Next week, we're going to be wrapping up the legislative updates, or the whole summer school webinar series with legislative updates from Frank Kerbin, who's the director of HR for the Business Council of New York State. To register, please go to walshtuffield.com/summer school. If you have any questions and would like to contact the Walsh Tuffield staff directly, please feel free to reach out with the contact information on the screen that you're looking at, and we're available to help you with retirement, risk management, employee benefits, or well-being needs. Thanks again for joining, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.